This is a short presentation on Raymond Chandler and the idea of the literary, designed to be viewed in connection to the course Literature and Publishing since 1820 at the University of Greenwich, and also in relation to Professor Andrew King's series of videos on detective fiction, which can be found on YouTube. Harper's is one of the longest-running American literary monthly magazines, whose first issue appeared in 1850. The issue for May 1948 contained an article by W.H. Auden, by then one of the most famous and significant poets in the English-speaking world, entitled The Guilty Vicarage, Notes on the Detective Story by an Addict. While his article does serve as an attempted justification of the literary value of some detective fiction, it also contains in the author biography something of an apology. Auden is the greatest living poet in English, and also enjoys reading for relaxation. Here explains the nature of his malady. Enthusiastic reading is an addiction, but this also suggests that reading detective fiction is not like reading poetry, possibly less significant by implication. In the article, Auden stresses that for him, Raymond Chandler is not interested in writing detective stories, but serious studies of the criminal milieu. Thus, as early as 1948, we can see that Chandler is presented as somehow apart from most other detective writers. His works are not minor writing designed for escapism, they are works of art. Chandler did not take too kindly to this, and in a letter he said of Auden that he leaves me cold and groping. I'm just a fellow who jacked up a few pulp novelettes into book form. This feels to me like a direct criticism of the suggestion that Chandler's novels could ever be taken seriously. In this presentation, I'll be exploring some of the issues that the disagreement with Auden raises, how far we should believe Chandler's claim here, and what debt his novels might in fact have to works of canonical 20th century literature, including poetry. This is a photo of the really very big crime section at Waterstones in Greenwich, taken late in October 2017. You can see on this shelf at the top that Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes novels are located here, and the volumes available include a Penguin Classics edition of the Holmes stories. In fact, other Classics editions too. Right next to these, by a quirk of the alphabet, we can find Chandler's novels, some of them at least. Both writers, then, are resolutely crime writers according to this bookshop. Compare this with the location of the work of Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who have also studied on this course. Here is Lady Audley's Secret, a novel which includes some detective work, packaged as an OUP World's Classic and located in a fiction section. The bookshop does not have a classics section, but if it did, I imagine that both this book and the Penguin Classic Sherlock Holmes novel would end up there, and Chandler might not. Raymond Chandler's The Lady in the Lake, which is a set text for this course, has been packaged in many different ways since its publication in 1943. I'm providing this slide to show the range of ways it has been packaged, and to suggest to you that each of these packagings suggests a slightly or a very different text. In my seminar, I ask students to consider which of these matches their preferences and reading of the novel. And if you've read the novel, you might have a think about this too. Chandler's novel The Lady in the Lake is a composite and expansion of several stories that originally appeared in Black Mask magazine. Here you can get a sense of the magazine and its concerns from the various covers which Google image search returns. You can also get a sense that there is some repetition in the kinds of cover that Black Mask featured. This kind of writing, for pulps as they were called, is reflected in these novel covers. If you bought one of these, I wonder what you might expect to find in the novel. In 3 of them, we are given the detective's name, Philip Marlowe, and one even tells us that he solves the vicious mystery of the lady in the lake. All 4 contain the depiction either of a female corpse or of violence towards a woman. The current Penguin cover, which most of you, if you bought the book recently, will have, is this. Some students in my group were confused by this image, and I think it is perhaps harder to read than we might first think. I want to think about why Penguin might have chosen this cover. It links it to a series with a Philip Marlowe mystery written at the bottom, and it also has a small silhouette of the man with a hat on. It quite clearly also recalls the recent packaging of Christopher Brookmyre's novels, which are comic contemporary crime fictions, and these covers themselves gesture towards the design of posters for the films of Alfred Hitchcock, no more so than this one for Vertigo. This demonstrates a perhaps deliberate archaism, a gesture towards earlier times. Yet for all the artistry of Chandler, Brookmyre and Hitchcock, The Lady in the Lake cover does not scream literary. Here are some other slightly less recent covers, the same novel. Chandler, as you can see, has been packaged as part of Penguin Modern Classics, though on the left-hand side this is a relatively old edition now, and it contains 3 novels, more for your money perhaps, but Virginia Woolf, for instance, is not packaged like that. The central cover here is one I want to focus on, as it links Chandler to the work of Edward Hopper. Hopper was 6 years Chandler's senior and, after some initial difficulties, became a central figure in American painting. He's perhaps best known today for works insinuating loneliness, including this painting, which is included in slightly different colours on the cover of the Chandler novel. Linking him to Chandler through this cover is, I think, quite significant. It links Chandler to highbrow painting. As Stephen Knight suggests, and as Auden did earlier, Chandler is seen as very definitely literary, by some at least. This is from 1980, but I think its meaning endures. What Chandler's natural audience lacked in sheer numbers, it made up in its hold on literary prestige and opinion making. He has gained special status as the most literary, and so the most respectable of crime writers. More recently, we can see this in the work of the influential literary theorist and critic Frederick Jameson, who published in 2016 a short book on Chandler. What's especially interesting about the introduction to this book is that it opens with what amounts to a justification of Chandler as literary. If Jameson still has to do this, or even if he still chooses to, it tells us that the idea of Chandler as literature still might need some justification. We don't see this in introductions to the work of Henry James, for instance. This is sort of odd because Chandler did have literary aspirations at an early age. He grew up in Britain and moved back to America as a young man, and while in Britain he produced several poems for periodicals, quite traditional in form and in tone. He came to writing detective fiction quite late in life, and he imagined that it would amuse his friends who knew of his earlier writings. You'll laugh when I tell you what I write, me with my romantic and poetical instincts. I'm writing sensational detective fiction. Sensational here does not mean sensation, but the echo is there. As the next few examples will show, Chandler's sensational detective fiction is alive to other forms of writing, not least to work considered literary. In Farewell, My Lovely, the lack of understanding of a goon to the name Hemingway is mined for laughs over an extended period. He dwells on this while others get busy with the issue at hand. I can't think of any reason why he should call me Hemingway, the big one said. My name ain't Hemingway. In The Long Goodbye, one character, Amos, enjoys alluding to the poems of T.S. Eliot, resulting in this exchange, in which Marlowe, the narrator, expresses shock at the end at the use of the word nonetheless. His response to Eliot's verse is that it means not a bloody thing, it just sounds good. And although this is ostensibly a joke, it also echoes T.S. Eliot's own idea, voiced in an essay on Dante, that genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood, and more generally at the modernist focus on atmosphere rather than meaning. We can see another example of this focus on words and understanding them in The Lady in the Lake, where Degarmo is very concerned that a clerk has used the word whom. Marlowe replies, yeah, but don't hit him. There is such a word. In perhaps Chandler's most ostentatiously literary passage in The Long Goodbye, Marlowe reads the writing of an alcoholic novelist, features this kind of fragmented associational writing that we wouldn't link to Chandler generally. And indeed, he's not famous for this kind of writing, interesting as its inclusion here is. Instead, he's famous for, among other things, wit. A blonde to make a bishop kick a hole in a stained glass window. As eyebrowless as a French roll. A voice as silky as a burnt crust of toast. He filled the doorway quickly. A homicide fast wagon sirened up. What all of these have in common is economy. The last two in particular provide an awful lot with very little. The movement and sound of the police vehicle is compressed into sirened. He filled the doorway quickly gives a sense of size, physical presence, speed and movement. Chandler has, as we have seen, disavowed the influence of writers like W.H. Auden and T.S. Eliot. And yet I think in this economy and compression we can see the influence of poetry related to theirs, specifically imagist poetry. Ezra Pound provides some of the rules, albeit retrofitted, of imagism here. 1. Direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. 2. To use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. 3. As regarding rhythm, to compose in a sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of the metronome. And we can see these in action in the work of H.D. Pound named her H.D. Amagiste in an act of dubious ownership, and this is the kind of poetry she produced. The white violet is centred on its stalk. The sea violet, fragile as agate, lies fronting all the wind among the torn shells on the sandbank. The greater blue violets flutter on the hill, but who would change for these? Who would change for these one root of the white sort? Violet, your grasp is frail on the edge of the sandhill, but you catch the light. Frost, a star edges with its fire. You'll notice the economy, the space on the page, the lack of superfluous words. This kind of economy can, I think, be located in the phrases from Chandler we saw earlier. And this suggests that those references to T.S. Eliot and Hemingway weren't throwaway anti-intellectual jokes. They were the remnants, possibly, of the influence of the avant-garde poets of the early 20th century. I'll finish now by looking at one other, clearer example of the literary in Chandler. The protagonist of Chandler's stories is usually called Philip Marlowe, and that name is retrofitted onto earlier stories where he was sometimes called John Dalmas. Marlowe is a relatively common name, but it pops up in literature, as a playwright for instance, and also the narrator of the stories of Joseph Conrad, who is pictured here. Chandler's choice, even if idle, suggests some real literary heavyweights. And an earlier protagonist, his first in fact, was called Mallory. This again must remind us of another name from literary history, Sir Thomas Malory, author of Arthurian legends in English prose. Hopefully this presentation has given a sense of the tension between the literary and the pulp in the work of Chandler, one of the most literary of detective writers maybe, but one whose work evinces and maybe is even generated by the tension between the elite and the mass market.